Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to begin. Please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. We would like to remind you that food and drink are not permitted in the theater. Also, please note that photography and audio and video recording is prohibited. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carol Olsen-Day of the New York Times, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this exciting Times Talks. We're live here at the Times Center in New York, and we're live around the world on nytimes.com/opinion. Tonight, we are enormously pleased to have as our guest one of our distinguished columnists. He's a must-read on the New York Times op-ed page in print and online. He also has The Conscience of a Liberal, which is the title of his blog on nytimes.com and of one of his best-selling books. His latest book is Stop This Depression Now, which he will be signing tonight after the discussion. Oh, and also he's a professor of economics and international affairs at Princeton University and the winner of the 2008 Nobel Prize in Economics. You'll hear from him in just a moment, but first I'm delighted to introduce our interviewer. He is also a distinguished op-ed columnist for the Times. And in his 17 years at the paper, he has worn a variety of hats, including chief restaurant critic, Rome bureau chief, and White House correspondent. He's also written two bestsellers, Ambling into History, a chronicle of George W. Bush's campaign for the presidency, and his memoir, Born Round. In today's column, he examines some pop culture affiliations of the presidential candidates. Please join me in welcoming Frank Bruni and our very special guest, Paul Krugman.
All right.
Thank you all for, are these working? You never know, it's a faith thing, yeah. Thanks for joining us tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about how it's going to go. Paul and I are going to talk for 45 minutes. I'm going to ask him questions about his book and about the election and other things, related things.
Yeah.
At about the 45-minute mark, you're going to see microphones set up in each of the aisles so that you can line up and ask Paul questions of your own. So when you see that happen, if you do want to ask Paul a question, please get in line at one of the microphones, and then we'll call on people from those microphones. At the end of the evening, Paul's going to be signing copies of his book, and I'll remind you at the end, so please stick around for that. Paul, thanks for joining us tonight. I wanted to start by asking you about the title of your book, which is very catchy, and there are two things in particular that when I first saw it and to this day really kind of stood out at me. One is your decision to use the word depression. You say not end this recession, not end this slow recovery, but end this depression now. Why do you choose that word, and are we thinking of it as something less than it is?
Yeah. So a recession is when things are going down. A depression is when things are down, and for a sustained period. And so, yeah, it's not the Great Depression, at least not so far. But it is. It's now almost 5 years since the economy headed down, and we're nowhere close to being back to normal times. We have, so this really long stretch of very poor economic performance is, depression is the right word. I also have a more technical sense. There's a special sense in which a situation in which the normal, the over-the-counter remedies for your economic ills don't work is what I call depression economics. So I had a previous book called Return of Depression Economics. So we are a depression in that sense as well. And this is, the awesomeness of this is what the people don't quite get. I think we've gotten accustomed to it. If you're wondering, I'm sucking our cough drop, which is why this, let's deal with that.
We're all friends, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how many people just saw that online, but it doesn't matter. The awesomeness of this, the fact that we are now, that we've had trillions of dollars of of valuable stuff we should have produced but didn't because of dysfunction, and much more important that we've had millions of people's lives ruined because they can't find jobs because and it goes on and on and on. So that's why I called it a depression.
You also, again, my second question about the title of the book, you end that statement, "End this depression now," with an exclamation point,
Right.
which to me almost signals you're saying we could if we just rallied. Are we doing something to ourselves, and I read your column,
Yeah.
so I know the answer to
Yeah.
this, but are we doing something to ourselves we needn't be, and could we end this now?
Yeah, so think of it, a bit of history. If you look at the late 1930s, it's not that different. We said the Great Depression was obviously much, much worse. If you're thinking of 1933, that was much worse. But if you think about the US economy in 1939, it probably had an unemployment rate. We didn't have the same data, but not that much higher than we have now. It was probably worse, but not dramatically worse. It was a depressed economy, but not the depths of the Great Depression. Lots of people at the time lots of experts said, well, there are no easy answers, and anyone who thinks that we can cure this quickly is misunderstanding, and all these papers in learned journals and articles in Fortune and Forbes and all that about how we had deep structural problems and all that. And then we began spending. We weren't yet in the war, but we began spending preparing for the war, and within 2 years, it was all, before Pearl Harbor, we were at full employment. We actually added employment grew by 20% in those 2 years, which is the equivalent of 27 million jobs right now, right? So it could be ended very quickly if we did what was necessary. This is completely a failure of policy, a failure of our political system, an intellectual failure. There's nothing out there that prevents us from having this over very, very quickly.
When you say if we did what was necessary, you mean primarily spend, yes?
Yes. Yeah. So the story, actually, the story of what's happened to us gets simpler, I think, as time goes by and we get clearer about what's going on. The basic story is that we had a period when we were complacent about borrowing. Private sector, not public sector. People ran up big mortgages, banks overextended themselves. Then we hit a moment when people said, we've been borrowing too much, and everybody at the same time tried to spend less. Everyone tried to spend less than their income at the same time. And the whole point about macroeconomics, the reason we need people like me, if you like, is to understand that there are things that apply to the economy as a whole that don't occur at the level of an individual family. If I want to cut my spending, fine. If all of us try to cut our spending at the same time, well, my spending is your income, your spending is my income, so we have a problem. And so what you need is for somebody to move in the opposite direction. That somebody really has to be the government. So keep on throwing these things, but if we discovered that we faced a threat from space aliens, and that we needed, and somehow to deal with this threat from space aliens, what really needed to do was to rehire all the school teachers we've laid off, and do a lot, and build a tunnel under the Hudson for
with the school
transit.
Teachers.
Right. Yeah. And no, whatever. But that we needed a program of spending on useful stuff to prepare for the attack by space aliens. Then we'd be back at full employment all of a sudden. And then if you say, oh, actually, mistake, there weren't any space aliens, we would nonetheless be in much better shape.
Would we be okay going forward? Having hired all those people, having spent all that money, one of the questions I think a lot of people think in their heads when they're reading is there not a point at which the spending must stop if it's deficit spending?
Yes, there is. And what you want is, John Maynard Keynes, the boom, not the slump, is the time for austerity. What you want, this is a transitional thing. We have a situation where primarily families actually are over. The biggest problem in the U.S. right now is that households overextended themselves and are too deeply in debt, and have been making an adjustment. We're actually probably about a third of the way back towards a sustainable level of household debt. But until they've done that, we need the government to be in there to sustain the economy. Once that deleveraging, the jargon proliferates, but it's useful. That once that private sector deleveraging has reached the point that you no longer need the crutch of government spending, then I become a deficit hawk. Then I say, let's pull back.
We're going to see you become a deficit hawk.
What?
We're going to see you become a deficit.
Yeah, you will actually. I mean, I was, early in the last decade, I was tearing my hair out over Bush squandering squandering our money on tax cuts when we did not need deficits. At that point, we didn't need these to be running budget deficits to sustain the economy. That was a time to be paying down the debt. Instead, we blew it on tax cuts for the wealthy. Now you want to go back to budget balance, but you want to do it, quoting St. Augustine a lot now. Oh Lord, make me chaste incontinent, but not yet.
Right.
So this is not the time to be doing this. Later.
Let's talk about the legacy of the Bush years. You make the good point that there were tax cuts then.
Right.
And when we listen to politicians now, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they're basically telling the bulk of people, I'm not going to raise your taxes, I might even cut your taxes. If we spent a lot now, and this debt gets bigger and bigger, what gives us any reason to believe the political will be there, or the will of people will be there 5 years from now to do austerity during a boom time?
I think there's one story people tell, which is just not true, which is that if you have a program of government spending to boost the economy, that the spending never comes down again. And that's empirically false, right? In fact, what we saw was that the Obama stimulus program phased out much too quickly. There is nothing in our record or that of any other country I'm aware of which says that the temporary spending that you try to use to boost the economy, that persists forever. Now, what is true is that if you try and tell a story about how the United States is eventually going to have a balanced budget, or close enough, it doesn't literally have to be balanced as long as the debt grows more slowly than the economy. But still, if we're ever going to get our budget under control, it's hard to tell that story without some significant rise in revenue. And there have to be some taxes, and you can get some of it by taxing the wealthy, quite a lot, given how big the tax cuts they got was. But even liberals would say, if you're honest about it, not enough. So yeah, at some point we need more, and this is a problem. We have a political system where campaigning against taxes has become a staple of both parties, much more so on one side than the other, but there are very few politicians out there willing to say, folks, there are things the government has to do, and that means that you have to pay some taxes to pay for them. So we're not at that point. You got to hope that eventually we have that kind of maturity returning to our political process.
In your book and in your column, you express kind of bafflement, wonder at the austerity Jones all around the globe.
Yeah.
Where did it come from?
Okay. So there are different levels. I mean, a lot of people who talk austerity or the need budget balance it's really quite cynical. I mean, you can even see that, right? Look at Paul Ryan, who says, I care about the deficit. The deficit is crucial. Debt is destroying us, and therefore we should start by having big tax cuts for the wealthy, right? So there, the austerity is all of that talk about deficits is actually just a way to make an excuse for destroying Medicare and Social Security and cutting aid to the poor. So there's a fair amount of just plain cynical exploitation of fears about the debt. But there's also a fair bit of especially in Europe, but to some extent here, people who sincerely believe that we really need austerity. And I think that comes out of there is an instinctive sense that if times are tough, that the answer must be that we all need to tighten our belts, including the government, that you really need to pull back. And that sounds sensible, it sounds serious. It happens to be actually extremely foolish, but it's very hard to get that message across. And I was a couple of years ago at an event in Germany, and
I figured we'd get to Germany.
Yeah, well, we were actually watching. My wife was with me, and we were. The keynote speaker was Wolfgang Schäuble, who's their finance minister, who is, by the way, I believe, a good man, but he is, as my sort of counterpart at the Financial Times, Martin Wolf says, in Germany, economics is a branch of moral philosophy. And so Schäuble was talking, and it was all morality the evils of debt and the evil. And my wife took off her headphones just to watch the body language, and then she said, as we leave this room, we're going to be given whips so that we can scourge ourselves. And there's a lot of that going on in the way that people talk about this. They figure times are tough, so someone must suffer. Whereas, in fact, the problem is, this is the time when you need to have at least somebody not suffer so they can support the economy.
What are some, you mentioned the word morality in the book as well. What are some other ways in which this notion of morality enters our economic policy in insidious ways?
Wow. So on the European side, so that's sort of splitting it. In the European side, their policy has been totally screwed up by the notion that it's all about spendthrift debtor countries and virtuous core countries, and all of the burden should rest on those spendthrifts to stop. So which is somewhat true as a story about Greece, but not at all about the others. But that has totally screwed up both the actual policy so far and the political environment, because the German voter, the Dutch voter, is convinced that the problem is a bunch of lazy do-nothings in Southern Europe, when that's not the story at all. The real story is housing bubble that was financed by banks in Germany and France. Here, well, it's the whole the unemployed must be lazy. I mean, one of the best things we could be doing right now in this economy is to be providing aid to the unemployed, both because it diminishes the amount of human damage, but also because, since the problem is not enough spending, putting money in the hands of people who are in fairly desperate straits is a very good way of sustaining demand. And yet, we have been cutting back drastically. We've left the unemployed in the lurch, largely because of this tendency to think that if you don't have a job, you must just not be trying.
I think
living high off the hog on unemployment. If you actually looked at what you get in unemployment benefits, that's ridiculous. But that doesn't seem to stop people.
Well, from the Clinton years on, with welfare reform, there's been this notion that the government should be careful about fostering dependency. Is that a false concern?
It's not totally a false concern. I think you can make an argument that AFDC, the program, welfare as we used to understand it, that AFDC in the year 1970 was too easy to get, that it maybe did foster dependency. But that's a long time ago now. And there's nothing in the U.S. system right now that you cannot have an even halfway decent life while choosing choosing not to work, choosing not to struggle. It's just, you can barely survive. Right. It's interesting because there was a little bit of reality. There were no welfare queens driving Cadillacs, but there was a little bit of reality to the notion of a culture of dependency 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. But now that perception is sort of freestanding. We've actually stripped away all of the, whatever generosity, whatever excess kindness might have been in our system is long since gone, and yet the perception remains.
The stimulus.
Wow. Yeah.
No,
right, the stimulus.
I'll ask a question. That's a big encyclopedia topic, but I mean, to a lot of Americans, they look at those figures, they say, Obama, we spent a lot of money. And you say that it was not the wrong thing, and in fact was just maybe too little and not the right way. Yeah. What should have been done?
Okay, first of all, 40% of it, almost 40%, was tax cuts, which are a very dubious effectiveness, because if you have a temporary tax cut, and particularly if you have a temporary tax cut for affluent people who are likely not living hand to mouth, they're going to say, that's a temporary tax cut. I really shouldn't spend very much of it. And so that's pretty ineffective. The pieces that were effective, fine. So we have something like $500 billion of aid to state and local governments, enhanced unemployment benefits, things that probably were a significant boost to the economy. But that's spread over 3 years. The U.S. economy produces $15 trillion worth of stuff every year. So you have $500 billion of actual stimulus in an economy that's going to be producing $45 trillion worth of stuff over the same period. It's just not big enough on this, relative to the scale of what was going on. So that was the problem. And the frightening thing about it, the thing that had me again more or less hysterical, read what I was writing in January and February of 2009, was that the stimulus was big enough to sound like a big number, but not big enough to actually deliver a convincing improvement in the state of the economy. So what you'd end up doing is discrediting the notion, and that's how it played out.
What would have been the right number?
Well, at least twice as big. I mean, knowing what we know now, it probably, and also longer. There was this thing about we have to have shovel-ready projects. If you can't start it in the next few months, don't do it. And yet, there was a lot of reason to believe that this was going to go on for years. I mean, even I am startled at how long it's gone on, but it turns out, given the historical record, given what typically happens after a financial crisis, we're more or less normal, this prolonged period of problems in the economy, which meant that projects that took 2 or 3 years to lay out would still have been worth doing. So there should have been more infrastructure. There should have been more aid to state and local governments because we've had big cutbacks there. And it should have been, instead of a fixed sum and a fixed timetable, it should have been contingent. There should have been guideposts, triggers. So when unemployment falls past X, then we're going to eliminate this piece of the program. And instead, we threw a fairly small amount of money one time. The peak impact came only about 1.5 years into the Obama administration, then it faded out rapidly, all of which was a recipe, not really for failure, because I think we actually did a lot better than we would have without the stimulus, but a recipe for the perception of failure, which has been a really bad thing.
Why did we, something that's concerned me a lot, why did we shortchange infrastructure to the extent that we did when we clearly have an infrastructure problem in the country and here was a golden moment to do something about it?
Shovel ready was a big issue. There was way too much belief. And this was at least partly. A lot of what has gone wrong has been the result of scorched earth opposition from the GOP. But there were some problems in the Obama administration. And part of it was that there was a significant faction that believed in a V-shaped recession. That believed that that once we stabilized the banks, the economy was going to come roaring back. And I think Tim Geithner probably, we don't know all of the details, but people believe that if you spent on infrastructure, well, we know that takes some time. I mean, some things take forever. I mean, the Boston Big Dig, right? 17 years. So you're not going to use that as a stimulus
Second
project.
Avenue subway.
Right. Yes, exactly. So there was a fear that you would be starting projects in the name of stimulus that wouldn't actually generate significant amounts of employment and spending until long past the economic crisis. But why there wasn't, but there could have been substantially more in terms of short-term stuff. There could have been, there are plenty of potholes, and in fact, we've cut back on infrastructure spending quite a lot because that's normally done at the state and local level, and we didn't provide enough money for the governments to continue with that.
Do you think it's one of the big regrets we're going to have going forward?
I mean, there's so many regrets. I'm not sure where on the scale of regrets that's going to come. I think that the biggest regret we're going to have is simply having allowed not just high unemployment, but very high long-term unemployment to persist for so long. I mean, the U.S. before this, there are a lot of problems long-standing problems with the U.S. economy, but one thing we've historically done for decades is had very few people who are unemployed for long periods of time. It was crucial, actually, because we have such a weak safety net that you pretty much have to get a job. So you had very few people who were unemployed for long periods of time. Now, all of a sudden, we have millions. Something like 4 million people have been really long-term unemployed. A lot of those people are never going to get back. Either never get back into the labor force or never get back into jobs that make use of their skills, or a lot of young people are never going to get properly started on their lives. That's, I think, the biggest shadow that we're casting. But yeah, when the economy recovers and more people from New Jersey want to come into Manhattan, and we've still got this tunnel that was completed in 1910 and runs at 100% of capacity, we're going to regret not having canceled that project to build a second one.
And now we're back. Now we're on to Chris Christie, whom I know you're a big fan of.
Yeah, right. This New Jersey thing, I got this. It turned out that the president of Estonia went wild over something I'd said in passing about his economy, and I couldn't understand the rage. And then I found out he actually didn't grow up in Estonia. He spent all his life in New Jersey.
And is related to Chris Christie, right?
I don't know.
Chris Christie really gets under your skin in a special way.
No, I just think he's actually not. I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, I have to say, since moving to New Jersey back, in 2000, I've kind of gotten into the spirit. I mean, I always liked the notion of a state where the informal state motto is, "You got a problem with that?" But no, Christie is. Let's put it this way: it bothers me a little bit, or it certainly is a bad sign that people think he must be serious about doing things and willing to make hard choices because he yells a lot. And it's not the same thing. In fact, he's not at all serious. In fact, confronted with major budget shortfalls now, with a state economy that's doing badly, all this talk about fiscal discipline, but he's not going to give up on his tax cut. So it's hypocritical. All of this talk about deficits and all that is just an excuse to cut programs that help people in trouble. But helping people who are already doing very well, that's a priority which must not be sacrificed.
I mean, you've written a couple of very powerful columns about Christie, also about Paul Ryan, both considered by the Republican Party among their brightest rising stars. Is there anybody in the Republican Party whom you think actually should be a rising star and is saying something sensible and hopeful?
Almost by definition, not. Because if somebody says something sensible, they are drummed out of the party.
Is there someone?
So John Huntsman was making a lot of sense, right? No, I mean, almost by definition. David Frum makes a lot of sense, is driven out. He's sort of a distant cousin of mine, by the way. But anyway, but no, I mean, you have this hardline ideology which happens to be false, and there's no room for dissent. It's not a big tent. So no, I mean, there's no way there, and it's been a part of the Paul Ryan phenomenon is driven in large part by the fixed belief of the media that there must be sensible, interesting people with ideas, good ideas on the Republican side, and so if you can't find any, you invent some. And so here's this guy who talks, uses budget jargon terms. So they say, oh, that's a sensible, serious. And of course, Ryan's been he's a phony and has been all along, but it's taken a really long time for that to sink in.
So it's all smoke and mirrors with him.
Oh yeah, there is nothing. The Ryan plan. I wrote about it way more than 2 years ago. If you actually take a look at it, it turns out that all of the alleged deficit reduction comes from magic asterisks, things to be announced later, and it's always been a fraud.
Do you think Paul Ryan himself realizes that? Has he convinced himself that it's a real plan, or when his head hits the pillow at night, does he say, "Another day got away with it, except for Krugman"?
That's always an interesting question. In general, I think there are fewer self-aware villains in life than there are in the movies, right? There are not very many people out there twirling their mustachios and saying, ha, ha, ha. But on the other hand, if you look at Ryan in some of his recent appearances, where he's been asked questions, serious questions finally, and the answers are so obviously disingenuous, and he looks uncomfortable. Now, I'm not big on that sort of thing, but you can just see that he's squirming. That I think at this point I'm not sure that 2 years ago he understood that he was faking it, but I think at this point he does know that he's faking it.
Did you watch the vice presidential debate?
No, unfortunately. I watched pieces of it later on, but where was I? I was in Asia.
And you told me backstage you're probably not going to watch the debate tonight.
No, well, for one thing.
Too risky for the blood pressure? Or?
Yeah, it's not good for the blood pressure. It's look, let's say I try not to get into too much of this stuff, but Obama was infuriating in the last debate because he reverted to type. Obama is a
type being
he wants to transcend partisanship. He wants to be to be a unifying figure, and that's his default position in an era when it's not going to happen. Now you can talk all of the bipartisanship and unification, and you're still going to be accused of being an atheist Muslim Kenyan socialist, and he reverted to type. He was ahead in the polls. He was starting to get comfortable, and he reverted to type in that first debate. Same thing happened, by the way, in 2008. People forget that as of early September 2008, it was a tied race.
Wasn't that because of the kind of false Palin bump after the Republican convention?
I don't think so. I think it was actually much close. It was genuinely close. It wasn't just the false Palin bump. It was partly
which
because
became a Palin trough eventually.
Right,
Yeah.
later on. But it was mostly Lehman that did it, right? But back then you looked and you saw that Obama, he would give speeches where he'd say things like, we had good income gains during the 90s, but in recent years we haven't. And he apparently couldn't bring himself to say that under Clinton we did well and under Bush we did badly. He did not want to be partisan.
He was praising Reagan instead, remember?
Yes, yeah. So he reverted to type in that first debate, which was disastrous. And I'll find out tomorrow what he did tonight.
You get angry with him when he tries so hard, and
Right.
you just kind of indicated that when he tries so hard to be bipartisan, that you're sort of suggesting he wimps out. If he's going to get anything done in Washington, is there really a way other than trying to bring people on the other side of the aisle around to him?
He isn't going to get people on the other side of the
So
aisle.
what's the answer?
He does what he can do. I mean, at this point, let's put it this way. At this point, Obama, if he is reelected, then the health care reform stays in place. And that already makes him the president who has accomplished more to make the lives of ordinary Americans better than anybody since Lyndon Johnson. So he does not have to move forward a major new legislative agenda in order to already have a huge achievement. Financial reform is also, it's well short of what we should have done, but Dodd-Frank is not a bad bill and could make a big difference. So he's got several major achievements that only need to be defended by him getting reelected. And by the way, those achievements, healthcare reform was done without a single Republican vote. So let's bear in mind.
But we didn't have divided government then.
Well, we had, that's right, although at the
probably-
last stage. But the point is, if you ask, what is the realistic prospect that you're going to get a bipartisan agreement on anything that isn't actually just a really bad thing in the next few years? I think the answer is zero. It's not going to happen. So Obama's position should be the most important thing he can do for his agenda is to get reelected.
Right. And how are you feeling about those prospects?
I haven't the faintest idea. I was feeling.
Because I'm guessing you prefer him to Romney.
Wait a second. You know that Times columnists are not allowed to do endorsements. So people have no idea.
You're not endorsing.
Yeah, people have no idea whom I prefer. So I mean, I thought
He's
that
voting for Gary Johnson.
right. I thought he had it. He was pretty solid. I thought 2 weeks ago, and then of course that debate really blew the momentum. And now, well, we'll see. It's an interesting thing because on the one hand, the economy is weak, and that makes it difficult. On the other hand, if you ask people about issues, they very clearly a majority favor the Democratic position on the issues, but they may not quite understand where actually Romney and Ryan are on those issues. So how does it play? God knows.
There's been the facilitation of some confusion by the candidates themselves, right?
Well, yes, there's a... Now, the thing about, Romney is really an innovator in this election. Let's put it this way, he's making George W. Bush look like a very honest man. Just came out today, actually, it was a very good... I've had my problems with Glenn Kessler doing the fact-checking at the Washington Post, but he actually sort of asked the Romney campaign to explain where their number of 12 million jobs comes from. And they said, well, there are these 3 studies that show it, and it turns out that, leave aside the question whether you believe that the plan would work, the fact is that they're lying about what those studies say. They're just plain lying. You have to use the L word. They're lying about what they claim is the supporting material. On the same thing, they've been going around saying there are 6 studies that support our tax plan. Right. And it turns out 4 of those studies are actually op-eds or blog posts. And one of the other 2 actually flatly rejects their main contention. So so this is a new level. There's a level of blatant sort of sneering dishonesty about this campaign that we have not seen in American politics before, not even under the Bush administration.
See, I hear the 12 million number, and before I even go to whether it's honest or dishonest, I think it's ludicrous to imply that you can have that kind of control. How much control do we really have over the sorts of big economic forces that are going to put us in whatever position we're going to be in 4 years from now?
That's where I mean, in a way, that's where I come in, because ordinarily presidents have very little impact. The outcome of the Federal Reserve chairmen ordinarily have huge impact. So what the chairman of the Fed does can have a huge impact on jobs. What the president does ordinarily can have very little impact. But these are not ordinary times. We're in a situation now where the Federal Reserve, which normally deals with recession or depression by cutting interest rates, has cut interest rates all the way to zero, and it's not enough. And so it's trying various exotic things which may help, which I'm in favor of, but we're in a situation now where Ben Bernanke has remarkably little power to boost the economy, and the President of the United States actually has a lot of power to boost the economy. So this time around, the normal intuition, which is normally right, that it doesn't really matter very much what the White House does, is wrong. Right now it matters crucially. It's all the difference in the world. I'll put it this way, if it made a lot of difference that FDR and not Herbert Hoover won the 1932 election. And we're in that kind of a situation now.
Okay, well, let's say Obama gets reelected and does not have a Democratic House to work with, because he almost certainly will be working with a Republican House. The Senate probably remains in Democratic hands. You say he has a lot of power. What can he hope to do with that divided chamber?
So first of all, it's what he doesn't do, right? So if we have a Romney-Ryan victory, they're going to move probably quite quickly to end Medicare as we know it. Think about what that's going to do as people realize that and what that's going to do to consumer spending. They're going to slash Medicaid, which means you're going to take money out of the hands of people who are already in desperate straits. So they would actually have a very major negative impact on the economy. So the first thing Obama can do is not do that. There's a lot of room still on the housing. You can do a lot of mortgages in this country are still owned by Fannie and Freddie, and many of them could be refinanced at lower interest rates if Fannie Freddie would waive down payment requirements, which is just an administrative step. The administrator of the program has been refusing to do that. That's something that you can come back to. That does not require legislation. You can come back to and turn up the pressure or fire the guy after the election. So there are several fronts on which a lot can be done. It would be a lot better if you could actually pass legislation. Also, let's say if the House is a wafer-thin Republican majority, then maybe you can swing a few people.
We're going to hear a lot, I suspect, in the debate tonight about tax loopholes, because of course Romney has said he's going to give us a tax cut but close enough loopholes to keep it revenue neutral, but he won't tell us what the loopholes are. Are there, in terms of tax reform, are there loopholes currently, things like the mortgage deduction, charitable deduction, that you think makes sense to close?
Yeah, but they're not. The ones where there's a really compelling case for closing them are not that big. So the big ones out there, all right. Actually, the lower tax rate on capital gains is a pretty significant one, and I would actually argue that that's a mistake. That we should have a single tax rate on income
and capital gains.
And that's controversial among economists. There is an economic case for having different tax rates, but on the other hand, the amount of gaming of the system that takes place in order to redefine income as capital gains is, I think, a compelling argument. So there's one. Of course, that's the one that Romney wouldn't even think of touching. That would strike right back at him, right? But the others, mortgage interest deduction is not good policy, but any quick change in it would inflict a lot of hardship on people who've built their family finances around the belief that deduction
Wouldn't
is there.
Wouldn't that depress spending further?
In the short run, right. So there's something you could, maybe a long-term plan to phase that out, but that would be a big change. There's the deduction for health care, for the employer contribution to health care, which you can make a case that shouldn't be there for economics, but actually, given the way our healthcare system works right now, that deduction is the glue that holds together I mean, we have this ramshackle healthcare system, which gets better under Obamacare, but still this kind of ramshackle. And it's actually being held together with Scotch tape, chewing gum, and a little bit of glue. And that deduction is part of the glue that holds it together. So that's, again, something you don't want to tackle anytime soon. So if you ask, are there huge deductions that you could reasonably want to eliminate, huge loopholes that you could reasonably want to eliminate right now? The answer is no.
If you could, from the perspective of a macroeconomist, dictate what the tax code and what the marginal rates would look like, what would you impose?
Top marginal rate should be significantly higher than it is.
How high?
Well, my former MIT colleague, Nobel laureate Peter Diamond, says 73%, so I'll go with that.
Starting at what level of income?
Starting very high. We're talking about million plus.
Okay.
And that's not a number that's plucked out of thin air. That's based on some really careful consideration. You know, it might be 80, it might be 65, but clearly higher. We've gotten to a situation where we've pushed down rates at the top end based upon the fixed notion that it's terrible incentive effects from high rates, which is completely rejected by all the evidence of history. Back in the days when that socialist Dwight Eisenhower was president, the top rate was 91%. Now that, even I think that's too high, but the fact of the matter is we had a pretty productive economy with much higher top rates than we now have. We have a problem. The really major disincentives in our system actually right now are not up there. The major disincentives are for the working poor, for people who are low-income workers who find that means-tested benefits get withdrawn as their income rises, which means that they will often, in effect, they'll face an effective marginal tax rate of like 80%. So that's, but that what actually says we need to have more generous social programs at the bottom, so which don't phase out so quickly, and that's where the reforms should be. The bulk of our tax system is really not that big a problem. People always talking as if there's something terribly wrong, but there's not a lot of evidence that the tax system is a major block to economic progress in this country.
People are starting to line up, and I imagine they will ask you economic questions. So my last question to you is going to be non-economic.
Yeah.
I once heard a rumor, and if it's untrue, we'll just quickly move beyond this, that you are a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Is that true? And please explain yourself.
No, it's not. I'm not hostile to it.
Gail Collins was the source of this rumor. So.
Right. No, I do like Joss Whedon. I think I like his.
Like Cabin in the Woods, or.
No, I mean but not that so much. No, my big thing is Isaac Asimov. There was the Foundation trilogy, if anybody's read that inspired me to become an economist, because I wanted to be, if you read it, this about social scientists who saved galactic civilization. And I liked it so much that they have a new deluxe edition of the Foundation trilogy just published by the Folio Society, and guess who wrote the introduction?
Joss. You.
Me,
oh.
Right, and you can actually
a little slow.
And you can actually read it on my blog, posted this afternoon.
All right, so go to his blog and
read my introduction to the Foundation trilogy.
Sir, would you please ask Paul a question?
Sure. Is anyone in Washington listening to you? And if they are, who? And if not, why not?
No, I actually do. I talk to people in Congress. I do talk to the Obama administration. Wearing my other hat as economic. As economist, I've talked to people. I've even talked to himself on occasion, and they didn't listen. Unfortunately, in 2009, when they might have actually been able to, do something, had more. But now it's not so bad. I mean, there is communication. In fact, I've been having fun with the speech recognition. Because I now know that if there's a message, the voicemail comes up on the text version as jeans, as in blue jeans, for a link, as in golf course. That's Gene Sperling calling.
Thank you.
The director of the National Economic Council.
You, sir.
Hi, Paul. There was a lot of talk this past weekend at the IMF annual meetings about how the U.S. needs to deal with the fiscal cliff. What is your response to the recommendations
Yeah.
to deal with that, and also to come up to set out a definitive medium-term, fiscal consolidation plan.
Yeah. Yeah. So the second part first, the medium-term fiscal consolidation plan, we do need at some point after the economy's recovered. We do need to bring spending and revenues in line. But needing to lay out a definite plan, who is going to be sitting at this table making that happen? It's just, realistically, it's not going to happen. So I don't believe in any of that. I mean, I believe that's in an ideal political universe what we should be doing, but given what we actually have, it's not going to happen. And it's okay, because the markets seem willing to believe that in the end, America will be rational. They're giving us a lot of leeway there, and that's not to worry about too much. Fiscal cliff. So if people don't know, the fiscal cliff is the Bush tax cuts all turn into a pumpkin on December 31st, plus the payroll tax credit expires, plus the plus sequestration. But the big thing is those tax cuts, which is not ideally what you'd want to have happen in a depressed economy. Even if you think that those tax cuts were a mistake, having it hit like that is not great. The term fiscal cliff comes from Ben Bernanke, and it's kind of unfortunate because it makes you think that on January 1st, if we haven't reached a deal, the economy collapses. It doesn't work that way. It'll be a slowly building impact over a number of months, partly because many people will probably rightly, but they'll see that their withholding goes up, but they'll figure that in fact a deal will be reached and it'll come back. So it'll be treated as not even a temporary tax cut. It'll be just treated as a temporary cash flow issue. So it's more like a fiscal slope that gets gradually steeper. It's not until probably April, May that you start to really worry about the economic impact. How do you deal with it? Well, again, in an ideal universe, we'd have a bunch of mature, reasonable people in Washington get together and reach it. My advice, I don't have any advice for the Republicans. My advice for Obama here would be actually to hang tough. That if he's already allowed himself to be blackmailed once, unconscionably, over the debt ceiling. He can't do that again. So he has to let this thing string its way along and let the Republican Party's paymasters call up the troops and say, no, you got to make a deal. You can't expect to get everything out of Obama. So I think I hope that we go, if he's reelected, I hope that we go a few months into the fiscal cliff as we try and reach a deal. But you have to be prepared to show that you're willing to suffer some pain in order to drive an effective bargain.
Yes, this is sort of a follow-up question. You are one of the most prominent and respected economists. A lot of the things you've predicted happen to have come true. Why then are you ignored by people in politics and people in the media, especially when it comes to entitlements and dealing with the deficit and austerity? And am I right to assume it would be for the best interest of this country that Obama does not reach a grand bargain with John Boehner?
Yeah. So I'm dreading this grand bargain thing. The way that Bowles Simpson has become elevated as this, and it's very much actually the modern Washington notion of a grand bargain. It's a bargain between the center right and the hard right, and as always, it starts with tax cuts at the top end. What are those doing in there? And of course, Bowles and Simpson have, as individuals, as people, have been wrong about everything. Right? They've been spending a couple of years, predicting the sky is falling, and so your question is why?
Why are you ignored? And why doesn't people take action on? Because you know more about the economy than anybody else. And why are you ignored so much?
There are a couple other people who know something about the economy.
Joseph Stiglitz, maybe.
No, but it's certainly been revelatory on economic issues, but on other things as well, that how little getting things right actually matters. that people have entrenched political positions, they have entrenched notions of what is a respectable position that tends to be very unresponsive to actual evidence, to the way things turn out. And it's not just this. There was a period back in the middle of the last decade. One of the places, I ventured outside economics for a while, being one of the few sort of major op-ed page people to say, we're being lied into this war in Iraq, which turns out I was right about that. But there was a period there, and people would actually say it quite openly, 2004, 2005, that in order to be considered serious on national security issues, you have to have supported the Iraq War. And you say, but the Iraq War was a mistake. Well, yes, but you're not considered serious unless you shared in that mistake, because that was the respectable position to hold. And there's a lot of that going on in economic policy now. If you are this vast turn towards fiscal austerity that took place both sides of the Atlantic in 2010 is now revealed as an incredible mistake, total falsity, and yet, if you were against it, you're still considered flaky and irresponsible. And only if you were for it, maybe if you shared the wrongness and then have changed your mind, then you're taken seriously. But if you were against it from the beginning, well, you're just not. So, but I don't think it's fair to say that I'm not being listened to. I'm not moving policy, but what can I say? I was in a few months ago, I was in a meeting where we had a little speech in England, speech by to the group by George Osborne, the British Chancellor, the Treasury Secretary equivalent, who's very glib, very persuasive, completely wrong, and he gave this speech basically denouncing those who say that our austerity program is wrong, I finally realized I was being flattered immensely, because those who was basically me.
Hi, thank you for allowing me to be here.
Right.
I just have a question with targeted spending, meaning since the problem is jobs, and although we're a consumer economy, it seems to me that spending on the consumer side only maybe helps inflation or provides low-paying jobs. It seems that if we are to come back in a big way and spending is the right path, that the spending needs to be spent in certain ways. How should we accomplish that?
Okay. I would disagree with the premise. What we need, most of all, is more spending. Doesn't have to be the best. Part of the point is actually we have the workers you employ producing stuff now would otherwise be unemployed, which means that the labor is essentially free. The money that the government would borrow to pay for things, it's paying historically low interest rates, and in fact, if you look at, the U.S. government does issue bonds that are protected against inflation, and those have a negative rate of interest. People are actually willing to pay the U.S. government to take their money. So you don't have to use it's not critical that you do the most efficient, most productive things. The most important thing is that you get people to work and do that however you can. That said, obviously, better uses are preferred. Better to build a bridge where it might actually do some good than to build a bridge to nowhere, but actually better in either case to build a bridge than to let the people be unemployed. I don't think you need to work. And at this point, one of the things I say in my book, in End This Depression Now, is that we are now at a stage. It's worth saying that the U.S. economy is showing some signs of recovery. We actually have, particularly in the last year, made some progress. Not remotely enough, but we made some progress. So what we really need to do is to build on that, get some more momentum, and we can get a lot of what we need just by undoing the damage we've done by spending cuts in the last 2 years. Rehire those school teachers. Restart those road repair projects that have been allowed to collapse. We've had a big fall in infrastructure spending in the last year because state and local governments have cut back. So you don't have to find a lot of targeting. We can just get back to doing the things that we were doing 2 years ago and we should still be doing.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit because I think your thoughts on what we should be doing right now are clear and cogent about some of the longer-term trends where working people and middle-class people have been getting hammered for decades now, and that the gains the economy does have seem to all go towards the top. Are there things like industrial policy or fair trade versus free trade or pension reform? What kinds of things would you suggest in the long run would really help our economy be fairer and more productive?
Yeah, those are much harder issues, of course. Actually, my 2 books back, The Conscience of a Liberal, that book was to a significant degree about that. And there are certain things that you can do. Having a universal health care system is something that makes life fairer and safer for everybody. And we sort of do if Obama's reelected. It's a Rube Goldberg device of a system, but once you've established the principle of universal coverage, then you can try and improve the way you do it. And so that you can do. You can have higher tax rates at the top end to help pay for some of these things. So but it's much more difficult to try and make the distribution of market income. Sorry, the jargon here, but what the government can clearly do is it can do aftermarket stuff. It can tax the rich more heavily. It can use that to pay for programs that provide more security to the middle class and the working class. It's harder to say what can you do to make incomes more equal, fairer distribution of income, even before the government taxes and spends. But there's some things that we think matter. Unions are an important equalizing force. And the collapse of unions in the United States is not it's not that the world doesn't allow unions anymore. Look at other advanced countries, they still have significantly more unionization than we do. Canada, right, that country up there, they almost even speak the same language, eh? And yet they have a dramatically different trajectory of unionization and, to some extent, of wage distribution than we do. You can, and look, there was nothing fated. Back in the 60s, America's biggest corporation was General Motors, and it had a strong union and paid good wages. In the 20-teens, our biggest employer is Walmart, which is completely ununionized and pays terrible wages. That's not a law of nature making that happen. That was because Walmart got big in an environment in which there was a very, very anti-labor tilt of government policy. We can change things like that. Maybe there's some question about whether even just the political climate seems to affect the distribution of wages. This is one of those things that sounds too squishy and soft for economics, and yet there's a lot of evidence that it does. And if we changed the attitude, if we got to a situation where extremely well-paid executives were actually under some scrutiny instead of actually getting to whine about how they're not properly appreciated and have nobody call them on their ridiculousness, we might have a more equal distribution. These things are hard, but you work on a bunch of fronts, and I think we can probably do a lot to make it a more equal society.
Good evening, Professor. We talked tonight about taxes. We talked somewhat about job growth. I wanted to talk for a minute about the banking industry.
Yeah.
For an economy to grow, you obviously need a stable, you need a transparent banking system. And I was reading one of the financial papers back in February, and I saw something that really struck me. I saw a chart that looked pretty much like the U.S. Open, where on the left-hand side of the chart, in 2006, you had 36 financial institutions that were merged over a period of 4 years into 4 giant money centers. The whole point of this article was, is the banking system more stable in 2011 than it was in 2008? Yeah. And what I'd like to hear from you is, first of all, an answer to that question. Second of all, I'd like to hear your opinion about whether you think the big banks should be broken up to better serve its clients.
Okay. I think our financial system probably is more stable because stability is not just a question of size. You can have a highly unstable system with lots of small banks. And for that matter, Lehman Brothers was not that big. What we had was a massively over-leveraged banking system, where particularly the shadow banks, banks that did not take deposits, but nonetheless, for all practical purposes, were banks, were very nearly unregulated, had enormous leverage. And that's been somewhat reduced, and Dodd-Frank, the financial reform, cracks down on that. So we probably have a more stable system, not stable enough, but more stable. Yeah, the big banks, it's not so clear that in sheer economics that the concentration is that big a problem. The Canada weathered this financial crisis much better than we did. I'm a little worried about them now because they have a housing bubble and high consumer debt, but their banking system weathered it. There were basically only 5 Canadian banks. So that having a concentrated system is not necessarily a bad thing. But what's alarming about our system now is the political power. When you have just these 4 giant financial supermarkets, and they are the whole game, then that could be fine if they're effectively regulated. But if they can buy the regulators, then they won't be effectively regulated. And so I think the argument for breaking up is not that the economics of too big to fail is such a big deal. Actually, I think that's a kind of a misplaced fear. Or put it this way, it's wrong to think that size is the only way that you can have financial collapse. You can have a fragmented financial system collapse too. But it's the political power. So we really should be, I'd like to see these banks broken up, but mostly just so that they don't have the kind of political clout that they now do.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a follow-up to the gentleman's question about the fiscal cliff. I think most people, or at least most people in this room,
Right.
would agree with you that the ideal solution is that they'll sit down like adults and come to some kind of a revenue plus,
Right.
Plus tax cuts kind of solution. But I wanted to ask the lesser bad scenario question. If either Obama cannot reach a deal because the Republican House blocks it and insists on the Tea Party platform, or if he loses, are we better off where he just says, you know what, my legacy will be letting the Bush tax cuts expire and not reach any deal, which would hurt the economy in the short term but restore rates to where they were in the 90s, or making what I think most people consider a bad deal that pushes that pain out into the future?
Yeah, and that's a question. To be honest, that I have, it's not really an economic question. It's right. We know that in general, either raising taxes or cutting spending in a depressed economy is not what you want to do in straight economics. But there is this question of what it does politically, and it's very hard to see. We're not going to be able to achieve a sustainable budget position without and still maintain any kind of social safety net unless we get back the revenue that was lost due to the Bush tax cuts. So yeah, my view would be that in the end it's better, in spite of the economic cost, better to let the whole thing expire. And among other, and that sets off a scramble. What do we do now, which might end up with something better? It's a hell of a way to run the world's greatest nation, but I think that is where we are at. And there's also some sense of we really don't want to let them get away with this. I mean, the whole point of the Bush tax cuts was to essentially to create a crisis. That's the star of the beast strategy is we cut taxes and you can never raise them again. That creates a crisis that then forces people to dismantle the social safety net. And we really don't want to let them get away with doing that. We don't want to see that strategy succeed.
I wanted to know your opinion on the growing mercenary army we have and its effect both morally and financially on our nation. And for my wife, if Romney wins, should we move to Canada?
Yeah. The trouble with Canada is that it's aside from cold, is that if you actually look at the geography, it's closer to the United States than it is to itself, which is always kind of there's some insulation, but I'm not sure how much from events here. Yeah, the mercenary, that's an amazing thing. that here we are in the 21st century and we are relying to a much greater extent than people would have thought conceivable not very long ago. We're relying upon mercenaries rather than proper soldiers. And, I've said, well, what's next? Tax farmers? Are we going to go back to 16th century modes of governance? And the answer is probably yes if these people get their way. They really, they would say, people who think that the goal of America's right wing is to roll back the Great Society and the New Deal are just not thinking big enough. Their goal is to roll back the Enlightenment.
A naturalized U.S. citizen of Greek origin. So obviously what has been going on in Greece, I've been following both at the personal level because my immediate and extended family is there, plus reading everything that I can lay my hands on. Today I was listening to the current crisis, which is that basically the government is trying to meet the new raised bar by the Troika, even though IMF admitted recently that the whole austerity thing has been a mistake and it hasn't resolved anything, but they're still trying. Now, given what is at stake, I mean, the whole society is falling apart. I even heard today that 2 million Greeks suffer from depression. That is in a population of 8 million, and that is a society that's not given to depression. What would you tell the Greek government at this point? What options do they have, if any?
Yeah. So for people who don't know, the Troika, in the European context, the troubled countries, Greece, Spain, I guess Greece, Portugal, and Ireland are under programs. Spain is on the edge of being under one. They're all kind of dependent now on loans, and it's the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF, which has traditionally been the hard men of the global economy, have actually turned extremely reasonable. And they've actually said, this is too harsh. Their latest World Economic Outlook is basically amounts to a diatribe against excessive austerity.
Yeah.
Which I'd say that's amazing. I'd say more that it would be more amazing if the chief economist weren't actually somebody who for many years was a colleague of mine at MIT, and it's actually not. There's not as much. There's more of a village aspect to this than you might imagine. But still, but the EU and the ECB are still insisting on this. And what's happening in Greece is that, as a condition for emergency lending, they've been required to make huge cuts in spending, some increases in taxes. By the way, the measure, the combination of tax increases and spending cuts is the equivalent of 16% of GDP. So in the United States, that would be whatever, that would be $2.4 trillion a year of spending cuts. Think about that. It's inconceivable. It's destroying the country. Yeah. Now, if I were prime minister, I mean, I actually have nightmares sometimes thinking of myself as the prime minister of a European debtor country, because they have no good options. Yeah. They have, you either go along with these austerity things, which are tearing your country apart, or the only alternative is to leave the euro, which is wildly disruptive and discredits. And what actually Greece really worries me, because they have a government of national unity,
yes,
center-right and center-left together, trying to make this austerity policies work, and they're not working.
Yes.
And the terms just keep on getting harsher. And if they fail, you have discredited the entire political center. You're left with, I guess, Tsipras, who's
exactly.
fairly radical left. And if he fails, then what's next is Golden Dawn, which is more or less out-and-out fascist. So you have these, it's a scary situation. I don't know what I would do if I were prime minister. I mean, it's nobody wants to pull that trigger and the nuclear option of leaving the euro, and yet in the end it may have to happen. If I were able to grab the lapels of the people in the Troika, I'd say, you do not want, what are you doing? This is not actually, it's not enhancing your prospect of being repaid. Demanding another 2 kilograms of flesh from the Greeks is actually making it less likely that you'll get any of the money back, because you're setting the stage for a collapse of the Greek political system and the collapse of
Absolutely,
Greek
yeah.
society.
Yeah.
So they really should let up. But it's very hard. Now, it's an interesting thing because the, you see, I'm fairly involved in this stuff, and it's a little bit of a relief to be talking about someone else's problems, but they're related.
Yeah.
The ECB is the European Central Bank is not is under fairly intelligent leadership now as well. Mario Draghi is, and I think that he actually privately, I don't know this, but judging from his actions, his view of how things work is probably not that different from mine. But he operates in a political environment where he can't get too far ahead of his constituents, which ends up being crucially the Germans, the Dutch, the Finns. And so everything he does is always a little bit, more than a little bit, but it's always palliative measures, but never enough. They're going to have to resolve this somehow, but I don't know. I fluctuate between believing that in the end, even the Germans will realize that they do not want to see this Europe destroyed. And I think that they will, in the end, loosen the terms and make it possible. But and believing that that would be just too big a climb down from their moralizing, from their view that this is all about the moral failures of the debtor countries, and it can go either way. But my God, it's incredible.
I know.
Greece is the
really
worst,
bad,
but it's not just. I mean, I have friends I know more people in Portugal than in Greece, and the amount of personal hardship that's being inflicted, the lives being destroyed, in the name of God knows what, because the policy doesn't even make sense. It's an amazing thing.
What you said about the finance minister, the German finance minister, sounds just about right.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. One wonders. Don't know what Angela Merkel actually thinks. She might be also. The trouble is that the public, and I blame the politicians for having sold a full story. They've been telling this morality tale, and because the quintessential crisis country in Europe is actually not Greece. Greece has a GDP equal to that of Greater Miami. The quintessential country is Spain. Spain is the center. And if you had a runaway housing boom that was financed by German Landesbanken lending money to Spanish cajas, which made irresponsible home loans, who are the villains here? There really are no villains, and yet it's being treated as this morality play of the evil spendthrift Southerners, and this cannot go on.
Yeah. Thank you.
We'll go over here to you, ma'am, and then we have enough time for the two remaining standing people. Exactly.
What do you consider as the greatest economic threat from the lame duck Congress?
Greatest economic what? Threat?
Threat.
Wow. Well, I mean, I actually am terrified. I don't know if the Congress alone can't do it, but I am terrified that Obama will let himself get talked into a really bad grand bargain, that he will accept, that he'll raise the Social Security retirement age, or something like that. That would be the most likely, in pursuit of a bargain which will undermine crucial parts of our safety net. And the thing is, I'm not sure, even now, that he understands that whatever bargain he tries to make will not stick. That right away, within a year, they'll be back demanding more. That they'll be back for demanding another round of tax cuts. That if you think that in the current political environment you can settle the issue of the budget, you can't. It'll all be renegotiated as soon as there's an opportunity. So that's what I'm concerned about. I mean, God knows, we might also have another debt ceiling confrontation. So there are all these things. The amount of mischief that is now possible. Let me tell you what I'm reading. Probably shouldn't have, but I've been traveling. What I had on my Kindle was Adrian Goldsworthy's the book about Julius Caesar, and I'm reading about the failure, the collapse of the Roman Republic, which was fated. It wasn't Julius Caesar who did it. And what happened was that basically all the norms of behavior that had held it together fell apart. Year by year, ambitious men became more and more ruthless, more and more willing to violate the implicit understandings that had allowed the Republic to survive. And I was thinking, yeah, that looks familiar.
Professor Krugman, thank you for your time. I'm an economics graduate student, and I was interested to hear what you think about the state of the economics discipline, and in particular macroeconomics. I've read you. I've read stuff that you say that macroeconomists haven't agreed on these important issues,
Yeah.
and but I also wanted to know what you think, what direction you think macroeconomics should take, given all these problems.
Okay. I have it's odd, my view on where we are in macroeconomics is a little bit convoluted right now, or it's an odd mix of things. So the first thing is that the profession has been a disaster in this crisis. That the big names have been all over the place, and that quite a few, we've had a long detour from my point of view in macroeconomics, where people turned to beautiful stories about the economy, which clearly imply that what has happened could not in fact happen. And you would think that there would be some rethinking, but one of my principles, I guess, in life is that nobody ever admits that they were wrong about anything. So instead of saying, gee, our models have really failed, they've just dug in further and have played a destructive role in our political debate. That said, in fact, the good old-fashioned models, the good old-fashioned ISLM, people has worked beautifully. If you were reading standard macroeconomics from 30, 40 years ago, and you looked at this situation, which is something we haven't experienced for 75 years, you would have made some predictions that sounded outlandish, like even big budget deficits won't drive interest rates up, and even printing a lot of money won't be inflationary, and cutbacks in government spending will have large, and it's all turned out to be true. Turned out that your basic models, which are still in many of the textbooks, have performed beautifully. So at one level, economic theory has been vindicated. It's been extremely useful, and not at all what wise men acquainted with the world said. This is a situation where practical men have been totally wrong, and people who are working with the abstract little models have been very right. So that's good, except unfortunately a lot of my colleagues in the economics profession have chosen to throw away the stuff that we actually did know. Last thing is there's a lot of really good work being done right now. What's happened is a real renaissance in macroeconomics of empirical work, of younger people doing really excellent work, looking at the actual data, looking at the actual experience. A renaissance of empirical work, a lot of looking back at economic history. We've really seen a resurrection of the study of history as a tool for understanding the present. Beautiful stuff. Actually, you can see some of the latest World Economic Outlook from the IMF is actually a beautiful document. It's a beautiful document describing terror and horror around the world, but but the way that they use the experience of Great Britain's return to the gold standard in the 1920s to shed light on the problems of European adjustment in the 2010s is gorgeous. This is what economics is supposed to be like. So I guess I am feeling optimistic about the prospects for economic research, for macroeconomics in the long run, which leads us to the obligatory Keynes reference, in the long run, we are all dead.
Well, that's a very nice segue into my question. I live in Shenango County in upstate New York, one of the 5 counties offered up as a demonstration project for high-volume hydraulic fracturing.
Yeah.
And some pundits say that the Marcellus Shale its production possibilities have been greatly overestimated, and that we've had the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, and there's a potential for a natural gas bubble. How would that, if that should occur, and actually it's had a huge effect on local people whose property values have gone down, who can't get homeowners insurance if they're in a spacing unit. But if that bubble should break, how would that affect the national economy?
Okay. My take on the whole shale fracking thing, and that it is something that has created, it's been hyped hugely. People talking as if this is transforming the economic prospects and so on. And then there's the question, is it real? Does the economics actually work that well? And of course the environmental spillovers and how are we going in the wrong direction? But I keep on coming back to the notion that people tend not to understand the scale of the U.S. economy, the scale of the diversity. And even a very big natural resource boom is not going to be decisive for the U.S. one way or another. We're just too big an economy producing too many things. $15 trillion a year goods and services. It takes a whole lot of shale gas to move that a lot. I mean, even all right, so the Mitt Romney, the now exposed, the false claims about studies. One of the things he was saying was, for his 12 million jobs, was he was claiming projected gains related to the shale boom, which was supposed to be 3 million jobs. And that was, part of the problem was that the study he cited said that this is what is going to happen. It didn't say this is what is going to happen if Mitt Romney's plan is adopted. It just said this is what's going to happen. So none of that was incremental from the Romney plan. But even so, 3 million jobs over 4 years in an economy which has 135 million people working right now is not that big a deal. So all of these things. So if it turns out to be a bubble and it bursts, that's a setback, but it wasn't that big a thing in the first place. It's a really, really big country with a really huge economy. And shale it's a remarkable thing. It's an amazing technology and a scary technology because of all the environmental impacts which we don't fully appreciate. But I think it doesn't move your estimates of what's going to happen to U.S. employment by more than a fraction of a percentage point in practice. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but if there is a bubble in shale, which some people are arguing, it's probably not even as big a bubble as .com. And we thought of the .com bubble and its bursting as being a huge event, but in retrospect, compared with the housing bubble, now that was big. But it's nothing like housing. It's nothing like the scale, and the harm it would do if it bursts is nothing like what the bursting of the housing bubble has done.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for your column.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Paul, you're going to go downstairs and sign books?
Indeed.
All right. He's just flown in from London today, and he's jet lagged, so be gentle on him.
That's right. I've actually literally been around the world in the past week. I have absolutely no idea what time it is.
Time to sign books. Paul.
Okay,
right.
thank you.
Thank you all.